morning. It's a great pleasure to be here to talk to you about the Resilient trial. I'm presenting on behalf of all the co-investigators, including our co-PI, Sheila Martins, and I'm surrounded by the two top enrolling centers, Francisco Montalverne from my hometown, Fortaleza, and Letícia Ribello from Brasilia. So why you should care about Resilient, we have a total of 8 randomized clinical trials, expanding all the way to the 24-hour window. However, it's important to acknowledge that if you actually replace the name of these trials with the countries that they originate from, they are all high-income countries. And the impact of these trials in the public healthcare reality of low and middle-income country was close to none. We tried to bring thrombectomy to Brazil as a registry after the positive trials were presented, and the Ministry of Health refused to do that. Under the unknown response to this question, would you achieve same high-quality reperfusion fast rates of the other trials and have a great treatment effect, or in our reality, that would not be possible to achieve? They did agree then to sponsor a randomized clinical trial to answer this question. Just so you understand the reality of low and middle income countries, here is the IV TPA story in Brazil. It took us 17 years since the NINDS TPA trial in 1995 to get a national policy where TPA would be paid in the healthcare public system. 17 years. You may say that's absurd. Brazil was actually the first country in the BRICS bloc, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, to pay for TPA in the public healthcare system. So the reality outside North America and Europe is if you have a private insurance, you get great care. Otherwise, you are at the mercy of the government. And when it comes to thrombectomy, you have had a very low penetration because the governments are skeptical they can implement that. Indeed, there are several reasons for that. The population is the public health care system of low and middle income countries. It's a much more vulnerable population, and our results actually will demonstrate that. Pre-hospital care, if things are challenging here in North America, you can imagine in places like Brazil. In fact, in São Paulo, one of our most developed capital cities, less than 18% of the patients arrive by the EMS system to the emergency rooms. Here is the typical emergency room in a public healthcare system in Brazil. Things are chaotic. We are under-resourced. So there are many reasons why things could go wrong. Biplane angio suite is close to science fiction in the public healthcare system. 100% of the cases were done in single-plane angio suite. The access to outpatient rehab is close to zero. So there are many reasons why things could have done it wrong. In terms of the design of the trial, this was very similar to the previous randomized clinical trials in the sense that patients were randomized to either thrombectomy or control, which will include intravenous TPA for those who qualify, and our primary outcome measure was the 90-day MRS in the ordinal shift. The study organization involved a lot of people, including some of our colleagues. They are present here today in the DSMB, and I specifically would like to thank Medtronic and Penumbra for the donation of the devices. If it wasn't for their investment, we would not be here today. David Libeskind was our core lab. Here is a map of Brazil. Brazil is a continental country. In fact, if you exclude Alaska, Brazil is larger in area than the United States. So in terms of the study design, this was a probe design trial. Essentially, patients have to have an NIH stroke scale at baseline that would be 8 or higher. They had to present within the first 8 hours from time last seen well. They had to fit the following imaging criteria on non-contrast CT scan and aspects of 6 to 10. For those few patients that could undergo MRI, they could have an aspects of 5 to 10. CTA showing an ICA, intracranial occlusion, or an MCA, M1 occlusion, and on CTA you exclude the black hole on the angiographic collateral score, essentially excluding the malignant collateral profile, as you see here. We did have a partnership in some centers where you could get Brainomix ESPEX and Schema View Rapid. Those were optional studies, and they were incorporated and served for sub-studies within the trial. The endpoints, as I said, primary was the shift analysis, secondary was independent outcome. The other endpoints were very similar to other studies. Our initial sample size could go all the way to 690 patients. First interim analysis, and it was at 174 patients. You had to achieve a P of 0.0125, and here is what happened. We achieved a p-value of 0.035 in the first interim analysis. The DSMB recommended the end of the trial. At that point, you had randomized 221 patients, 111 in the thrombectomy arm, 110 in the control arm. We essentially had follow-up in almost all patients, with only 1 out of 221 patients losing follow-up at 90 days. There was a single case of crossover from control to thrombectomy. Here are the results. The treatment controls were very well balanced. The NIH stroke scale was 18, slightly higher than in the other trials. In terms of the comorbidities, you can see that things were very well matched. We have here the treatment selection modality in terms of imaging. About 40–45% of the patients underwent CTP. Very few patients, less than 2%, underwent MRI. And most patients had only CT and CTA. When you move to the distribution, 20% were ICA, with the remaining mostly being represented by M1 occlusions. The total number of device passes had a median of just 1, with a range 1 to 3. We had TK2B or greater of 75%, with a core lab adjudicated full reperfusion of 26%. In terms of our primary outcome, you can see an important shift towards lower disability with the thrombectomy treatment, with an odds ratio adjusted of 2.3, highly statistically significant for our primary endpoint. We also noticed that the rate of excellent outcome, 0 to 1, was 3.4 times higher with the treatment, and functional independence was 2.6 times higher with the treatment, both highly statistically significant. The number needed to treat for one independent outcome was 6.6, very similar to Revascat. So here you see the mortality. I think this is one of the things that really calls the attention for the differences in relation to the other trial. Very high mortality, not significant, but numerically lower in the thrombectomy arm. When you look at 5 and 6, you achieve statistical significance to decrease the bad outcomes. The trial was very safe in our healthcare reality. And here are some time metrics that I think are worth discussing. Our door-to-needle time was actually one of the best out of any of previous randomized clinical trial, only being behind of the ESCAPE trial. In terms of time metrics for thrombectomy, door-to-groin and groin-to-reperfusion mirror essentially Revascat, very similar to Extend IA. But here you had almost no transfers. Those are mostly mothership cases, and you know that with transfer cases, these times tend to be faster. So I think that was a very good result. The rates of reperfusion, again, core lab adjudicated by David Lebeskine, who did the HERMS analysis. If you exclude the CT perfusion studies, was one of the largest of the randomized clinical trials. In terms of the treatment effect, again, you can see we're very, very similar to the Revascat trial. Symptomatic intracranial hemorrhage, you see that the difference between treatment and control was one of the smallest of all the trials, although numerically higher. This really depends on the criteria you use. It's more important to look at the gradient. But here is something that it's really important to consider. Along with the greater vulnerability of our population, you can actually see that the mortality rate can be as high as threefold in relation to the trial performed in North America. The rate of functional the bad outcomes 5 and 6, we have discussed that. And again, the highest in the trials. We're about to conclude here. Just want to discuss briefly the subgroup analysis. If you actually look at the heterogeneity of treatment effect, specifically looking at aspects or whether or not the patient underwent CT perfusion, there is no difference in the treatment effect size. You can see here that whether or not you had CT perfusion, this is not necessarily a target mismatch, but you imagine most patients had target mismatch. There was no difference. Same thing for independent outcomes in terms of imaging and mortality in terms of imaging. No difference either according to aspects of CT perfusion. One thing that you found was the so-called age paradox. You can see that in our previous trials, elderly patients, even though they have worse outcome, they have larger treatment effect size. In Resilient, actually, for the first time, you saw an inverse relationship. And in fact, patients that were 71 or older had a very small treatment effect. And in terms of independence, they almost had no benefit, as you can see here, crossing the boundary and very close to one. So this brings actually questions about the cost effectiveness of treating these patients in the public health care of our country. There are several other studies that you are now planning about to start, and with that we conclude. I think you could show for the first time that the effect of mechanical thrombectomy is so robust that it can overcome all the challenges that you can find in under-resourced countries with public health care reality, that it's very far than what you had in the first 6 randomized clinical trials in the early window. And with that, I just want to conclude by thanking our colleagues. And with this last slide here, where you have the initial trials that impact dramatically the 20% of the high-income countries. But we really hope that Resilient will serve as a stimulus to increase the amount of penetration of thrombectomy in the 80% of the world population that it's mostly served by the public health care systems of low and middle-income countries. Thank you very much for your attention.